I promised you a stellar cast, and we have one of the brightest stars in the built environment galaxy, the man who puts festival into world architecture and brings us future projects awards when there's absolutely no chance of them actually being built. But that's the measure of the man. Please welcome Senior Vice President of IBP, Paul Finch.
Gerald, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for that. It's very good to be back at the Four Seasons. I think a really great refurbishment. I'm glad to see they've kept these chandeliers. I look at them and I'm reminded of Lord St. John's remark on these occasions, which is, the chandeliers, I'm not sure if they're early Aztec or late Aztec, but they give lustre to this evening. I have two very simple tasks this evening, which is to introduce first a person who's going to speak to us briefly and then take part in the award ceremony, and then secondly the person who's going to compare that award ceremony. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Daniel MOYLAN, Deputy Leader of Kensington Chelsea Council, and I'm sure for many people in this room who know what he's done for London, a bit of a London hero. He was the person who cleaned up Kensington High Street, getting rid of the clutter and the fencing and the nonsense, which made it a rather gruesome experience, by taking personal liability when nobody else in the authority would do so, for actually achieving the construction and engineering works, which made it a much more agreeable and civilised environment. And guess what? You know, instead of motorists ploughing into pedestrians outside Harrods, when they realised that actually there was nothing between them and a gigantic lawsuit, they all slowed down a bit. Now, that was the first contribution, in a sense, to a notion of taming the car and making London's street life something approaching civility. The bigger project was, of course, Exhibition Road, the first time that we'd gone in for kind of mixed mode use in the Dutch fashion. Again, a huge political effort of will almost to make this happen, given the potential oppositions of a range of people, from the highways engineers to guide dogs for the blind, and all those people who only ever see the downside and the difficulties, and they, of course, have to be resolved. And resolved, I think they were triumphantly, so that now, across the world, Exhibition Road is cited as an example of how you can make a major thoroughfare a united experience for cyclists, for motorists, for pedestrians, rather than that notion of the silo urban motorway, which has blighted so many urban environments. It's not just traffic, although Daniel MOYLAN has run in a kind of GLA capacity transport for London, but he's also, in his own borough, supported really high-quality buildings and developments. For example, after 40 years of nothing at all happening, we're finally getting a conversion of that marvellous 1960s Commonwealth Institute building to the new Design Museum, a terrific achievement, with the first housing scheme to be built in London by OMA and Rem Koolhaas. And knowing the difficulties in a pretty conservative place like Kensington and Chelsea, where you have a mixture of the kind of conservative libertarians, if you like, not to say anarchists, who are quite happy for people to do what they want to do, set against people who, of course, have quite legitimate worries and desires to keep things pretty much as they are. And Daniel MOYLAN's had to tread a tricky path between, on the one hand, promoting something which makes this borough and London part of the 21st century, and yet at the same time not going so far as to actually destroy the thing that's given its character in the first place. Now, finally, in case you think that he's entirely traffic-bound and earth-bound, we now notice that a political career which reminds me of the Himalayas, ladies and gentlemen, rising effortlessly from peak to peak, that Daniel MOYLAN is now Mayor Johnson's emissary to the skies. He is the person who is responsible as a deputy mayor for London for aviation policy. And if you think that roads and traffic and Exhibition Road and Kensington High Street were difficult, think about the dilemmas on every front of determining the future of how London and the South East, and in a sense the whole country, is going to organise itself in respect of aviation policy over the next 50 years, if not the next century. And it falls to Daniel to reconcile, on the one hand, the Mayor's absolute desire not to see Heathrow expanded, with the party leader's desire to kick it all into the long grass for 3 years until after the next election, with the competing interests that think either that an estuary airport will be the great British engineering and architectural contribution to global infrastructure in the next 50 years, or that why do we have to do that when we could simply put more runways in at Stansted and link it all up to Crossrail. Now, these issues are of such a scale, they involve High Speed 2, they involve European aviation policy, they involve pretty much everything you could mention. So I'm delighted in welcoming Daniel MOYLAN here because, apart from anything else, he has his hands extremely full with what I think David Mirren might regard as either heaven or hell looking down from the heights of aviation towers. Daniel MOYLAN.
Well, Paul, thank you very much. I'm very touched, actually, by those remarks, which are extremely flattering. Thank you. And thank you for asking me this evening. I shall try to be short. I find that quite difficult normally. So if you start to get bored, if you just sort of wave or talk amongst yourselves, I'll realise. Otherwise, I could go on quite a long time. But what we are here tonight as part of a huge celebration. And there are a number of things we're celebrating. And the first is we are celebrating, in perhaps its darkest hour, we are celebrating the best of British journalism. Now, it is possible, if you have spent a year or more with your nose stuck in the murkiest, tackiest and nastiest end of the journalistic experience that Britain offers, that you could come up in the next week or so with some very, very daft ideas. But if you actually had asked, let us say randomly, not me, but Mr. Justice Leveson, to come and give the prizes this evening, and he had seen and had been made aware of how much British journalism does actually achieve, then I think he would agree with Boris, as I do, that it is not an activity that needs any regulation by the government or by statute. So let us celebrate this evening the best of British journalism, and we'll be giving awards out for that later on. We're also celebrating an amazing year. It has been absolutely astonishing. It seems almost a very long time ago, but the summer that we have been through was one that absolutely astounded ourselves. None of us expected either that we would deliver to the extent that we did as successful a set of Games and Paralympic Games as London achieved. But we also astounded ourselves, I think, in the way in which we treated each other, in the atmosphere that we generated, in the contentment that we had being with each other and amongst ourselves, as we actually somehow for a while stepped back from the rat race and the competition and the pushing people on the tube and all the other things that we spend most of I'm as guilty as the rest of you, don't worry, that we spend most of our time doing. And it really was an astounding sort of paradise summer in a way, not only in what we delivered, but also in the way in which we achieved it. And we will be celebrating that too, I understand, because I believe that many of the awards that are being handed out a little bit later are in fact related to journalism that covered things connected with the Games, quite understandably, in this remarkable year. And that success in the Games gives us cause also to celebrate London as the most astonishing place. I've become really quite chauvinistic over the last few months about London. I've always been in favour of cities, and I've never quite seen the point of the countryside. But I have generally kept that opinion to myself in the past for fear of being accused of some terrible political incorrectness and generally giving offence, but actually I am more and more convinced London is such a fantastic place. I am less and less embarrassed by saying that I'm not the slightest bit interested, actually, in what happens in the countryside, in preserving it, or whatever. Cities are the homes, they are the incubators of civilization. And a city like London is a success. And we need to turn our minds to what it is that makes it a success. And one of those things, and here I come to talk about the great subject of the day, my great subject of the day, one of those things is the fact that we are directly connected in a way that isn't true of lesser cities. We are directly connected through aviation with all the other great cities in the world. It is somehow, when I started working for Boris, people talked about London as a world city, and I had no idea really what they were talking about. I didn't say that at the time. I just sort of smiled and so on. But when I asked myself, what is a world city? What are they talking about? Does it just mean a big city? What is a world city? Only when I started working on aviation with Boris a couple of years ago that I realised that almost the defining characteristic of a world city is that it is directly connected through frequent flights with a whole network of other world cities. So that if you don't live in a world city, if you live in a perfectly pleasant place like Manchester or whatever, you will take a plane, and you want to go somewhere, you will take a plane to your nearest world city, and you will get on that great super conveyor belt, which is the global aviation network. And then when you get to your destination, you will either stop because you've arrived, or you will take another plane to some other non-world city somewhere randomly out in Utah or wherever it might be that isn't a serious place. And that is what you do. And it is that connectivity which is crucial to London. Without that connectivity, we would not be attracting the businesses that establish their headquarters here, that provide us with those good jobs. There are very few foreign businesses that come to this country to establish themselves that are providing anything other than good quality jobs, well-paid jobs, jobs that people want to do. We want to attract those people here. We will not do that if they cannot get here. That is why we need proper connectivity. And Heathrow can no longer supply that. Heathrow is a very constrained site. Now, you might say, when you've done your little bit of tracing paperwork, Heathrow is at least as big as Chelsea. But Chelsea is not big enough to have a serious airport. And Heathrow has grown up in the most astonishingly ill-organised way, naturally, because it's grown like Topsy. And a third runway, which would only be a short runway, apart from demolishing 600 homes, would sit the wrong side of the A4. You could hardly believe it. The planes would have to, from the rest of the airport, would have to cross the current north runway to get to it. A new terminal would be required to serve it at a time when airlines are trying to consolidate into a single terminal at Heathrow. The whole thing is absolutely constrained by its history, by its size. It will be a Heath Robinson contraption. It is a waste of funds to invest further in it. And this is all quite apart from the deleterious effect suffered by the at least 800,000 people who are currently affected by, in their homes, by excessive airport noise as a result of Heathrow's operations, a number which will increase. And I'm only going to give you one statistic this evening, but I enjoy it, and it is that the European Union monitors noise in people's homes at 82 airports across Europe to a standard level. And of all the people in the whole of Europe who suffer from excess noise in their homes, 28% are affected by Heathrow. The equivalent figure for Paris is 0.1% for Charles de Gaulle. And what that means is we have left, Heathrow is in the wrong place and Charles de Gaulle is in the right place in terms of the amenity of the people who live close to that airport. So we need a new one. We need the airport, we need a hub airport. We don't need to add to the patchwork of the astonishing patchwork we've created through 40 years of neglect. You could say that we have 4 full-length runways operating commercially, serving London at the moment, just the same as Frankfurt. You could say that if you wanted. The difference is, in Frankfurt, they put them all in one place and call it an airport. What we have done through neglect over 40 years is we have scattered them randomly throughout the southeast. We could, of course, adopt a policy of saying that's what we want to do. Or we could say we don't want a hub airport. We could say that what the Dutch want and have created for themselves, the Germans, the French, sundry American cities like Dallas, Fort Worth, and so on, what they have done for themselves, the conscious creation of a hub airport that brings passengers together, concentrates them in one place, and so allows more planes to fly with more passengers, and therefore allows the airlines to serve a wider range of destinations with greater frequency. We could say that they are all wrong, and that the British approach of keeping your head in the sand and not doing anything for 40 years is in fact a cunning stroke of genius. I just find it difficult to believe that that is a correct interpretation of the state we find ourselves in. So I think we need one, and then the question finally is, where do we want it? And here Boris speaks very clearly as Mayor of London, and what he says is that if you go to the east of London, East London, what you find is still depressingly high levels of joblessness, shocking levels of short life expectancy compared to the rest of London and the rest of the country, a whole range of indicators of deprivation, which will only be reversed by opportunities for jobs, for growth, for the education and training that goes with those jobs and growth. And a new airport to the east of London, be it in the estuary, possibly Stansted, be it on artificial islands, be it on artificial land, be it on solid terra firma. He's open to all those ideas, all those locations. Foster's, Gensler, Ken Shuttleworth. Bring it on, he says, bring it on. The more proposals, the better, because they're all emerging at the moment. And well done. Let's get those proposals out on the table. But to have that airport out to the east of London would be, in planning terms, the most transformative thing that we would have done in the southeast of England in at least a couple of 100 years. It would actually, we would still be feeling its effects a century from now. People would be arriving at that airport, going to downtown London, and it would be embarking. That is the sort of change that we're actually going to achieve. And if we can do what the Dutch and the Germans have done, if we can have under that airport a railway station, and I don't mean a Toy Town railway station with a little Crossrail train tootling into the centre of London, or even worse, one of these fantastical ideas for linking our terminals from one airport to another, so that people would imagine that by landing at the North Terminal at Gatwick and then taking a train round the M25 and finding their way to Heathrow Terminal 5, that somehow they were still in the same airport, that somehow we could confuse them into thinking they were still in a virtual hub airport, when the Germans are offering 45-minute direct connections and a matter of only a few hundred yards to walk. When we get all those ideas off the table and we have that airport out there to the east of London, the most transformative thing, and sitting on a railway station directly connected into the European high-speed rail network, just as Schiphol Airport is with the station, just as Frankfurt is with the station that sits under that airport. And we have an integrated transport solution, and one that is sustainable and one that is economically transformative. Then I think we will be able to say that we have achieved in Britain and for Britain the sort of promise and the sort of transformation that we showed over this summer we were truly capable of doing. And we are capable of doing it. And I know that you in the press, especially those of you who follow the built environment, the planning, the highways, the rail side, all the things that you follow are going to be absolutely crucial. So if I achieve nothing else this evening, I want to turn you into cheerleaders for what will be this most fantastic of projects. And in the meantime, let me congratulate you on your success this evening and on the awards that you so richly deserve. Thank you very much indeed.